Our speaker today is A.C. Grayling. He is a British philosopher who is one of the United Kingdom's most revered public intellectuals. He is the author of over 30 books and is currently Master of the New College of the Humanities in London. Today he'll be discussing his book, Democracy and Its Crisis.
This being New York, this being Penn, this being Carnegie Council, that overlap of Venn diagrams makes me quite confident that you were all reading Plato in bed last night. So I can remind you of what you encountered when you read Book 8 of the Republic of Plato, Plato's attack on democracy. He gave democracy such a bad name in that account that it took more than 2,000 years before anybody stood up and said that something of a democratic order was a necessity for people who live under the laws that a government passes, giving therefore a necessity that there should be a voice that people might have in choosing that government and in giving consent to the laws under which they live. Let me just remind you that Plato said the problem with democracy is that it is just really ochlocracy in disguise. It's a wonderful word, that ochlocracy, O-C-H, means mob rule. That the reason why democracy collapses into mob rule is that ordinary people are insufficiently well informed, they're too short-termist, they're too self-interested, they're very often too prejudiced, and as a result there will always be a great deal of conflict of opinions and different sets of desires, and that if you put political authority into the hands of the people, what you will get is anarchy pretty soon. And when anarchy occurs, because it is exhausting and because you can't get anything done, people will pretty soon welcome a tyrant, somebody who will come in, impose order, and get things back on track. History, if you look across the great landscape of time, seems to bear this view out. Think about the French Revolution, for example, ending as it did with Napoleonic rule. And Plato, in fact, was himself adducing some historical examples of things that had happened in some of the polities of the ancient Greek city-states where just this sequence of events had happened. So he was extremely skeptical about the value of democracy and indeed thought it was only a step away from the very worst possible consequence, which was tyranny itself. Now, his reason for thinking that ordinary people were really incompetent to be the source of political authority in a state is a reason which has been shared by many people since. Everybody knows that Winston Churchill said democracy is the least bad of a lot of bad systems. But they forget that he also said that the strongest argument against democracy is 2 minutes conversation with any voter. And he meant exactly what Plato meant, that you would very, very quickly discover all that short-termism and self-interest and lack of information. The point was put much more trenchantly, in fact, by H.L. Mencken, your wonderful satirist, who said to believe in democracy is to believe that collective wisdom will emerge from individual ignorance. And again, that is just a reformulation of the Platonic view. But I like the anecdote that's told about Adlai Stevenson. You remember the great Adlai Stevenson, when he ran against Dwight D. Eisenhower back in 1952. He'd be a very intellectual, rather scholarly man. And somebody said to him, "Mr. Stevenson, every thinking person in America is going to vote for you." And he said, "I'm pleased to hear it, but I need a majority." Well, this is exactly the difficulty that Plato had identified. And there are many, many people who still think that way. But in the autumn, as we call it in England, of 1647, the new model army, commanded by Fairfax and Cromwell and Ireton, was in camp in a place called Putney, just outside London. It was then a little village outside London, in a moment of pause in the English Civil War. King Charles I had been defeated at the Battle of Naseby. He had been put into house arrest at Hampton Court. And the New Model Army was discussing with its commanders, who were called the grandees of the army, what the constitutional settlement would be when the war was finally over. And they wanted to have biennial parliaments, universal adult male suffrage. They wanted to have equal treatment in law. They wanted the House of Commons, the elected House of Parliament, to be the one where real political authority lay, not in the Crown and not in the House of Lords. In fact, they were making a demand for a form of democracy, limited, of course, because it was men only who would have the vote, but a demand for democracy which hadn't really been heard for over 2,000 years, since Plato had given it that bad name. And of course, the demand was refused by the grandees of the New Model Army, who thought that it was unthinkable that people should have the vote merely because they were adults or adult males. They thought that in order to be a participant in the government of the country, you should have a stake in the country. You should own property. You should have a property qualification, because only then are you really interested in good government. Only then would you use your vote wisely. If you gave the vote to somebody who didn't have any property, what would he do with it? He would use it to dispossess the people who had property and redistribute the property to himself. So of course you're not going to give the vote to the poor or to the people who are not educated. And that marked a moment in the beginning, the middle of the 17th century, the beginning of people thinking that there is something not to the point about the kind of consideration that Plato adduced about the incapacity of so-called ordinary people to be the locus of political authority. That's not the point. Not the point about whether you're educated or not, or informed or not, or own property or not, but that just in virtue of being a citizen, just in virtue of your status as a member of the society, since you are going to live in that society and be governed by its laws, you should have a voice. And this was the point that was made by one of the contributors to that debate in Putney, a man called Colonel Rainborough, who memorably said, "The poorest he in England has as much of a life to live as the richest he." And that completely shifts the weight of the debate away from questions about who is entitled to participate to the idea of your right as a citizen, your right to a voice. And progressively over the next couple of centuries, through the work of John Locke in his second treatise on government, the thinking of Montesquieu, the very, very interesting work done by people like Madison and Jefferson here in the new United States at the end of the 18th century, when pretty well from scratch a new set of institutions was being constructed in order to parlay the consent of the people, as Jefferson put it, into a governmental structure which represented the interests of the people, through to de Tocqueville, Benjamin Constant, and John Stuart Mill in a book called Representative Government, published in the 1850s, at a time when the franchise was being extended more and more in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain as it then was. These ideas, the ideas about how you can really get the voice, the consent, the agreement of the people to government, these ideas were taking concrete form, and a development of structures was underway to make that possible, because something had been recognized, something implicit in that remark that Thomas Rainborough made in 1647. And it's this: if there is a right that somebody has just in virtue of being a citizen to having a voice in government, then, given all the problems that arise of the kind that Plato had identified, or other difficulties that might arise, or disparities that there might be in wealth and education and so on in society, what about a correlative right, another right which is very important, namely the right to good government? We have a right to good government. Why? Because if we don't have good government, or let me rephrase that slightly, because after all, outside this room, there is nothing perfect in our world. So we can't expect to get good government if we mean anything too utopian by it. But let me use the phrase good enough government. Let me use that phrase in more modest ambition. We have a right to good enough government, because unless we have good enough government, really good enough, then all our other rights are unclaimable. We don't have a right to assembly, to autonomy, to privacy, to freedom of expression, to all the civil liberties and the human rights that condition our experience as adult human beings in a grown-up world. You can't lay claim to those things unless the order in which you live is sufficiently stable and mature. So you have a right to that. So the right to a voice and the right to good government constitute two rights which have to be able to connect with one another. And what people like John Locke and Montesquieu and Madison and others were thinking was, how do you translate the expression of that right, the right to a voice, into the good enough government that people have a right to? And the answer is through a set of institutions and practices. A set of institutions and practices which will ensure that the consent given, the agreement given by the people is respected in what comes out of the governmental process underwritten by the politics, which produces that governmental process through these institutions and these practices. Now, one can go into detail about how step by step these ideas emerged, but the net effect of these ideas was the idea of representative democracy, where the adjective there is of the first importance, representative democracy. And what that means is this: we elect representatives. We elect people to go to the legislature, and we may elect our chief executive as well. And we send them off to wherever it might be, to Washington or to Whitehall, to do a job of work on our behalf. The job of work in question is to get the information, to do the due diligence, to listen to argument, to discuss and to debate, to form a judgment, and to act on that judgment. And if we don't like what they do, we can kick them out next time, and we can put in their place somebody who will do a better job for us. We send them there as our representatives to do that, not as our delegates or our messenger boys and girls. They're not going off to Washington or Whitehall just to report what the majority of people in their constituency happen to think, or in their district. We send them there to go and get those facts and do that thinking, and to listen to reason, we hope, and to act on it. That's the idea embodied in the notion of representation. The control that we have is the control of recall. If we have a good, a responsible fourth estate, and I have to say, in the United States of America, you're better served than we are in the United Kingdom in that respect, I'm sorry to say, because of the very corrosive effect of the tabloid press, so-called red top press in the United Kingdom. But responsible reporting, investigative reporting, holding to account, asking pertinent and tough questions, that's a really important part of the process between elections. The interaction of citizens and their representatives is very important in a representative democracy too. But the thing which is of greatest importance, of course, is this possession of an extremely valuable thing, which it took centuries and a lot of blood to get, and that is a vote. And that power of recall, that power of appointment, that power to confer a plenipotentiary responsibility on people to go and do their job of work on our behalf lies at the very heart of the idea of representative democracy. So in the ideal, and we're talking here about a slightly utopian situation where we have very good, honourable, intelligent representatives who understand perfectly well that what they're representing is the interests of their voters and of their country. And so they go off to wherever the legislature convenes to discuss with rationality in a well-informed way what would be the best thing to do in the general interest. That's the utopian vision. Now, unfortunately, as franchises have extended, and we can think of the process in the United States as rather similar to the UK. You know, by the First World War, there was pretty well a universal adult male suffrage in the UK. The franchise had been extended little by little, just eked out by those in power to stop, too much revolutionary sentiment. By the First World War, it was universal among males. Because of the great contribution that women made in the First World War, in munitions factories and in the land army and in hospitals, women aged 30 and over were given the vote in 1919. I suppose this was on the assumption that by the age of 30, women might have grown a brain cell or two and could read a newspaper. The voting age was only equalized for men and women in 1928. The voting age was only made 18 in 1968. So you can see that the extension of the franchise has been very, very gradual and very grudging. But of course, as the franchise has been extended, so politicians and political organizations, political machines, have recognized that in order to get their agendas through, they've had to learn how to manipulate those structures, to pull the levers in the right kind of way, and to influence from within those institutions so that the party agendas can be got through. Now, I'll make the following remark about the system in the UK, but you'll see the parallels with the US situation. In the United Kingdom, there are two major political parties. There are a couple of others. There's a third, rather small party, but mainly it's two political parties. These two political parties, in order to get their agendas through the parliamentary process, have to exert a very, very strict party discipline. They have what's called the whipping system. Well, it sounds a bit problematic, but actually it comes from fox hunting, where they whip the dogs into pursuit of the luckless fox. And the whipping system involves obliging members of your party to vote for your party line, no matter what they personally think about the policies in question. Whether they're against their conscience or against their better judgment, they're whipped into it. And the whipping system is very strict. If you don't obey the party whip, you can lose the support of the party at the next election. So you don't get funding, you don't get support, you don't get the party machine behind you. But there's also, and it's a rather well-known fact, that in the UK Parliament, at any rate, the 3 Bs are standardly employed to ensure the vote. And the 3 Bs are blackmail, bullying, and bribery. The bribery in question is, we'll give you a ministerial position or more support at the next election and so on. The blackmail is, well, it works like this actually. If you ever meet a British MP, you should say to them, tell me the very first thing that happened to you when you reached Parliament. And they will say, oh, the whips invited me to tea. And the whip said to me, you're now one of us, and we're going to look after you. And in order to look after you, we need to be able to protect you from anything that anybody might be able to, creep up on you and attack you about. So any secrets? Did you ever have your hand in the till, or what's going on with you and your secretary, or anything like that? Just tell us your secrets so we can protect you in case anybody finds these secrets out. 3 weeks later, you want to vote against the party line. They come and say to you, if you don't vote with us, it's going to be all over the newspapers what you did. I mean, they gather all the little secrets that they can. This is the blackmail thing. The bullying thing, well, there was a famous case just a couple of years ago of a member of Parliament being frog-marched into the lobby that his party wanted him in, with his arm up behind his back, held there by 2 other MPs. Now, you might ask yourself the following question: how is this possible? The answer is because the common law of England doesn't apply in the Palace of Westminster. The Palace of Westminster has a peculiar, I mean that is the literal term, and also the correct term, status in the kingdom where the common law doesn't apply. If I, as an employer, were to bully or blackmail or bribe any of my employees, quite rightly I would be up in front of an employment tribunal, PDQ, as they say, pretty damn quick. I'd be there the next morning. But in Parliament, they do this all the time. What is the net result of this? The net result is that your representative in Parliament is not representing you any longer, but is representing the party line. If that isn't a perversion of democracy, I don't know what is. And it's a much, much bigger and more significant issue, the idea of party discipline, of the control of the party machine, of the process, in our legislatures than you might think. It's a serious matter. It's equivalent in seriousness, really, to the role of big money in politics. Now, it happens that I think this problem is a more serious one in the United States even than it is in the United Kingdom, but it's bad enough in the United Kingdom. Here, of course, as a result of a Supreme Court decision a few years ago, which has allowed the formation of super PACs, you've now got extremely large sums of money applicable to the purchase of seats in the House of Representatives or the Senate. And if you had enough money, you could go so far as to buy yourself the White House. So that's a very serious matter too, when very, very, very large sums of money are applied to the distortion of the process of selection and representation in a country. So those are functional aspects of how the institutions and practices which were designed to take the consent of the people into good enough government have been captured and have been distorted by the influences inside the practice of these institutions. I think that our system of representative democracy in the UK and the United States, and they have a lot of similarities to one another, they after all come from a common root, can be saved relatively easily. A very modest and moderate and small c conservative set of things can be done which would make our representative democracies work as they're meant to work. It's a pretty good system in a way. It's a pretty good system because although it would be very desirable for more people to be more actively engaged in politics and for local politics to be more significant feature of people's lives in a way that would feed up into national politics, still it's the case that we've all got our jobs to do, our families to look after, our interests in life, and we don't want to be looking over the shoulders of politicians every minute of every day. We would like to be able to trust the system. We would like to be able to send good, responsible people to do this job of work for us, and we would like to be sure that the institutions would work properly so that we would get good enough government. That, I think, is one of the big arguments in favor of trying to make the system that was so carefully and painfully devised over the last couple of centuries, to make that system work. But in order to do so, it has to be transparent. It has to be transparent. We have to break the grip of party machines on the way the institutions are run. We have to make sure that big money doesn't distort the process in ways that are very partisan, that only serve the interests of a particular section of society. We've got to make sure, in other words, that the system works as it was designed to work. Now, a lot of people come up with a lot of very exotic other ideas. What about sortition? Sortition is where we just, by lottery, choose people to go to the House of Representatives for a year and make the decisions, and then we cast the lots again, and another group of people go. So that's one suggestion. A suggestion that I don't mind is epistocracy. Epistocracy was Plato's idea that everything should be run by philosophers. Well, that's okay by me, I don't mind. But I think it's a bit implausible. And then very occasionally I think of some of my fellow philosophers and I think, oh, hang on a second, I think perhaps we'll stick with representative democracy. But we could make representative democracy work, and we should demand that it does. Transparency being absolutely key, breaking of the grip of the party machine, and control over the amount of money that is spent on elections. And those three things, just by themselves, would reclaim for us something that is designed to work in our interest. I'll stop there, Joanne.
The United States has had a series of crises of democracy over our history, even since the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Red Scare period, the McCarthy period, Watergate break-in, and so on. Each time, democracy and liberalism have been restored by, in the wake of these challenges. Is there anything about the current challenges that causes you to doubt that there will also be a return of the pendulum in due course?
Well, do you know what? I think there are two very positive signs, actually, which the Trump phenomenon And I have great diffidence here. I sympathize with your pain about this, so I don't like to prod into it too much. But you have a president who is probably the least qualified individual in the history of the world, or at least since Caligula anyway, to hold high office. And it must be tremendously worrying and embarrassing as it is for us Brits at the moment. We're embarrassed by the stupidity of Brexit. But here in the United States, two things that strike me as being very positive. One is that the whole false news, fake news agenda has been instantly spotted, and people are alert to it. It's not as though we are still in the dark about it. It's not as though we're still being over-manipulated by it. Of course, too many people are, but there is quite a lot of pushback against it. And secondly, your institutions in the United States are looking very robust. Look at your courts. Look how they've, knocked down some of the diktats that have come out of the White House on immigration and people traveling here to the US, for example. Look at the way some of the states, like California, for example, have just refused to accept the Washington line or the White House line anywhere on climate change. This is, to me, it's evidence of the robustness of some of the structures that you have in your country, and that's a great optimistic sign, I think. And probably in the end, the pushback will win.
I think certain philosophers would make good politicians. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.